I don't know quite what wandering I'm going to do today. Yeah, lovely.
Not too much.
Not too much, all right. So what does Easter mean to you? Is it mostly about the chocolate? It certainly was when I was a kid. And it's an important lesson to learn when you're a child, that you can have too much of a good thing. And did you eat as much chocolate as I did and then make yourself sick? No, you didn't. Well, that was very wise. I certainly did. And I did learn that lesson that, you know, it's nice to enjoy things, but there is a place to stop. And I think it's an important lesson to learn as you go along. Those Easter eggs have been in short supply. 2 supermarkets in Britain have sold out. And people, it says there, look, have been fuming. Because you couldn't possibly have Easter without an Easter egg, could you? Well, actually, Jesus did have Easter without an Easter egg, so it is possible to have Easter without an Easter egg. But from that one Easter egg that was invented by Fry's down in Bristol, 90 million this year. That's how many they've sold in Britain, 90 million Easter eggs. Wow, that industry came out of nowhere, didn't it? Or are you going to make off down Dobbies, like we did on Friday, and have a look round and see if there's some nice new plants that you can kill this year in your garden? Or have you had the family round for a nice meal? It's nice to get family together, and if you can do that, that's a wonderful thing. Or have you been out for a walk? Because we have just got the most glorious Easter weather. Hasn't it been perfect? And look out there, wow, that's fantastic. So maybe a nice walk. And those, for many people, are the main elements of Easter. Family, chocolate, walk, DIY, bit of work in the garden. The origin of the word Easter is interesting. According to the Venerable Bede, who was a 8th and 9th century monk who wrote extensively about the English church and people, he said that it comes from an Anglo-Saxon goddess called Easter, O-E-S-T-R-E, of fertility. It is from where we get the word estrogen, interestingly enough. But that's been questioned a lot these days, because Bede is the only place where you can find reference to that. I don't think I turned myself up again. Do you want me to be a bit louder? No, definitely not. Okay, well, you've got it anyway. And so that's been questioned now, and a lot of people aren't convinced by that. And if you look at Encyclopaedia Britannica, it is now the widespread consensus that the word Easter derives from the Christian designation of Easter as in albis, a Latin phrase which is understood to mean dawn. So the word Easter actually means dawn. And the word east is the same, because they both point to the rising sun. So it's interesting, isn't it? It comes from the word white and lightness, and it's why Britain is called Albion, for the same reason. Because when the Romans came across the Channel, they saw the white cliffs of Dover, and they called it Albion. And it's also why the white of an egg is called the albumen. It's all from the same root as Easter. Wow, didn't know that stuff. And I just learned something this morning. But here's a picture. Here is a graveyard on the east coast. And there are a few of these, like Dunwich, that are just slowly going over, aren't they, as they erode at the bottom and they're going down, which is a pretty odd thing. But here is a graveyard with, well, what's this picture of?
Sunset.
No, it's on the east coast.
Sunrise.
Very good. It's on the east coast, so this is a picture of sunrise over a graveyard. And I like that as an image of Easter, because the good news of Easter starts in a graveyard. But it is the dawn of new life, new hope, faith, and everything to do with Jesus' resurrection. When they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them sneered, but others said, "We want to hear you again on this subject." This was the reaction of the Apostle Paul when he preached in Greece, in the Greek town of Athens, about the resurrection. And as soon as he got to the bit about Jesus rising from the dead, do you see this? The people, some of them sneered. Sneering isn't just saying, "I don't believe it." Sneering is saying, "I don't believe it, and you must be an idiot to believe it yourself." And you might be thinking, "Well, Simon, you look like a reasonably intelligent person. I hear you passed your 11 plus. Do you really stand there and tell us that Jesus died and was buried, and then on the third day rose again and came back to life? Is that really what you believe?" Yes, that is really what I believe. And do you believe that that was physical, resurrection? Not just like Jesus lives on in my heart. No, Jesus rose from the dead in a physical way. And you might think that is absolutely astonishing that anybody could believe that. In these days, it's 2023, for goodness sake. Man walked on the moon 50 years ago. Can you really believe this stuff? But I want to point out that people have always been cynical. People have always found this hard to believe. It wasn't that people were gullible in those old days and easily fooled. As soon as Paul got to the bit about resurrection, they said, oh no, that's enough of that. That's nonsense. And so this has always been the point at which people say, I can't believe that. But if you accept the gospel narrative, if you accept the story of who Jesus is and why Jesus came, the resurrection isn't a stretch at all. It's inevitable. If Jesus is the Son of God, which is who he said he was, if Jesus came on a mission to save, Jesus' own words of his describing his mission, I came to give my life as a ransom for many. That's Jesus' own description of what was going on. If you believe who Jesus is, if you believe that's why Jesus' mission was about, that he came to give his life as a ransom for many, then if you take those presuppositions, the resurrection is inevitable. It couldn't have turned out any other way. It's the only outcome that could have happened. The incarnation, that was optional. Jesus didn't have to come. He only was born because he loves us. But if you accept that part, then the rest of it, it's the only possible outcome, is resurrection. So here is Mary, and Mary, the mother of James and Salome, bringing spices on the morning of Easter Sunday to anoint Jesus' body. I've just circled Mark 16 because you can read this in Matthew or Mark or Luke or John. If you want to read the story of Jesus' birth, you can read it in Matthew, you can't read it in Mark, you can read it in Luke, you can't read it in John. The Christmas story is only in 2 of the Gospels, because it's not really the most important part. But the stuff about Jesus' death and resurrection, the last week of Jesus' life, occupies about a third of the Gospels. Because that always was the main point of it all. That always was where it was leading. Another thing that I put up here is a question mark. And the question mark is this. Where's the men? Where's the men? They're all missing. The whole story here turns on the faith and the devotion and the love of the women. And it's a tragedy that within church life the role of women has often been played down. Whereas in the Gospels, when you read them, the role of women is fabulously important. And read them again and see what I say is right. Look at Luke's Gospel, how Luke notices what the women contribute and how important they are to the progress of the story. But none of these women come expecting anything to do with resurrection. Not one of them comes. What's happened? Jesus has been hurriedly put into this tomb, and the women who love Jesus were not able to anoint his body with the oil and spices that go with death. And so they wait for the Sabbath to be over, because you're not allowed to do that kind of stuff on the Sabbath. And then as soon as the Sabbath is over, they go to do these last offices of love to the body. They have no thought of resurrection at all in their heads. And nobody does. None of the disciples do. And if this whole thing was some kind of conspiracy, they'd have been working at it. But what's so fascinating is that none of them expected resurrection, even though Jesus had told them. And so they come to anoint a dead body. They asked each other, who will roll the stone away from the entrance to the tomb? This is their worry. They've got up at first light, they've come across the city, they've gone to where Jesus was buried, and they are very worried about this. Who will roll the entrance away from the tomb? I don't know if you know what the tomb of Jesus was like. It had a great big stone like this, and this was common practice. This is common layout for tombs of this period in rocky ground. You have to deal with bodies pretty quickly in hot climates. And so the body would be put in through there. This stone was in a track that is slightly downhill. There's a stone here to stop it rolling, just a wedge. You take that out and it rolls down the track and it covers over the entrance. That stops anybody going in there. That keeps out the foxes and all the other animals that would get in there. It's just the way that they stop it being too odorous. And that's the normal layout. And if you wanted to go into a tomb, then you'd have to roll this stone back up its track, and it was uphill. And the ladies were thinking, we're not strong enough to do that. This is a posh tomb. The wealthier you are, the bigger this entrance is. And the bigger that entrance is, the bigger the stone has to be, because it won't cover it. See what I'm saying? And it says in this story, did you notice it was a very large stone? Because Jesus wasn't buried in his own tomb. Jesus didn't have any money. He was buried in the tomb of a man called Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich man, who donated his tomb at the last moment. So this is the pattern. So there's the stone, down this track, there's the little wedge, and you'd have to roll it back. And that's what these women were talking. There's 3 of them. 3 women could be pretty strong, but this must have been a big stone if the whole way they're thinking, we're going to need some help. We can't do it. They should have taken a big long lever with them, shouldn't they? If they'd taken a big long lever, they could have done it. They'd have been plenty strong enough. The very thing that they were worried about all the way there turned out not to be a problem. I just want you to spot that little thing. Linda tends to be a bit catastrophist. That is, she always thinks that everything's going to go horribly wrong and it's all going to go downhill very quickly. Is that right, Belinda? No. And you know, we spend an awful lot of our time worrying about stuff that actually doesn't happen. And it's a lot of, if you added up all the time you spent worrying about stuff that never happened, it would be a lot, wouldn't it? We could have saved ourselves an awful lot of time. And I just think that's a lovely thing. The very thing that they were the most worried about was not a problem at all. When they looked up, they saw that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. And at this point, if you try and put all the stories together, Mary saw from a distance that the stone was rolled back, turned round and ran to tell Peter and John about it, because she was sure that somebody had taken the body. She never got close, she just turned and ran at that point. As they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side, and they were alarmed. Don't be alarmed, he said. You are looking for Jesus the Nazarene who was crucified. He is not here, he has risen. See the place where they laid him. And this is the first announcement of the resurrection. I don't know if you spotted it, but there is no account of the resurrection in the Bible. The moment of resurrection isn't recorded. We know absolutely nothing about it. The angels didn't roll back the stone to let Jesus out. They rolled back the stone to let us in and to show us that the tomb was empty. Jesus had already risen. Interestingly, he's not here, he has risen. See the place where they laid him. And you imagine this angelic creature pointing at an empty space. And you think, how's that evidence? How can an empty space be evidence? See the place where they laid him. How can that prove the point that you're saying to me? Well, interestingly enough, the Jewish burial customs of the Israelites, they picked it up when they were down in Egypt. You know what Egyptians do, don't you? Huge mummification. Well, when they were down in Egypt, and then they became prisoners, and then there's the whole Exodus thing, they brought with them some of the Egyptian practices. And so bodies were wound round with sheets, and in were poured spices and aloes, which is a kind of it's a gluey, resinous substance. And so what happened was, it was a kind of mummification light. And when Jesus' body went from the tomb, what was left behind was this, like a cocoon. Can you see that the thing was all still wrapped up, but the body was gone? And that actually was evidence. They weren't pointing at an empty space. The angel was pointing at these grave clothes. And in John's Gospel, we read, finally the other disciple who had reached the tomb first, this is John, also went in. He saw and believed. Mary's the first person to meet the risen Jesus, but John is the first person to believe. And he believes on the evidence of just this cocoon of grave clothes that could not have been made by any other way than wrapped around a body, still in the shape of a body, but the body's gone. And John, who was a deep thinker, looked at this and saw what none of the others had seen. Peter didn't see it, none of the ladies saw it. Peter saw it and realised that this was proof of resurrection. It's only just the beginning of proof. There's an awful lot more to come. Remember how he told you while he was still with you in Galilee, the Son of Man must be delivered over to the hands of sinners, be crucified, and on the third day rose again, says the angel to the women. I love this line. Then they remembered. Yeah, you would remember. You've just been told. Of course you can remember. But do you know this is so significant? I'm going to show you Matthew 16, Matthew 17 and Matthew 20. Look, Matthew 16. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things at the hand of the elders, the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Matthew 17. The Son of Man is going to be delivered into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day he will be raised to life. Matthew 20. Jesus was about to go up to Jerusalem. He took the 12 disciples aside and said to them, "We're going up to Jerusalem, and the Son of Man will be delivered over to the chief priests, the teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death. He will be handed over to the Gentiles to be mocked and flogged and crucified, and on the third day he will be raised to life." On at least 5 separate occasions, Jesus told his disciples in the plainest possible words that this was what was going to happen. He was going to go to Jerusalem, he's going to be arrested, he's going to be crucified, and on the third day rise again. Those 3 are all from Matthew's Gospel. So isn't it amazing that the disciples had no thought of resurrection, even on that morning? They were about as thick as us, because they've been told again and again, but they still haven't taken it in. But here is the news that goes with these women. "But go tell his disciples and Peter, he is going ahead of you into Jerusalem." I've underlined "and Peter." Why is that like that, do you think? Why have I picked that out?
Because he denied it.
Very good, because of Peter's denial. And you might think that after Peter's triple denial of Jesus that he would be, chucked out. You can't stay with us anymore. But it's to the disciples and Peter specifically mentioned that he's going to go ahead and you will see him there. And that's a great message for any one of us who thinks that we've just kind of sunk too low, slipped too far down, gone so far wrong that God won't ever be interested in us, that God couldn't take any notice of me, that I certainly couldn't be part of his plans. Isn't it great that there's Peter named there specifically? So that when that message gets back to the disciples, Peter doesn't think, well, it's not me now, is it? He's actually named and pulled back in. And that's the great message of the Christian gospel, God's forgiveness because of Jesus' life. You will see him just as he told you. There are many, many very tiny little subtle things that link the birth stories of Jesus and the death and resurrection stories. And this is one of them. Do you just spot that? Just as he told you. Do you remember the shepherds go and they go and see Jesus, and then they say it goes on their way rejoicing because everything was just as they had been told. And that's that same phrase here, just as he told you. Do you know this is always true, that whatever Jesus says is just as he told you. Jesus has never said anything that hadn't worked out. Jesus never said anything that hasn't proved to be right in the end. Trembling and bewildered, the women went out and fled from the tomb. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Isn't this a surprising ending to Mark's Gospel? It kind of peters out. It kind of stops. And you think, where's the great resurrection stuff? Where's all that stuff? And it kind of doesn't finish. And it's a very surprising ending. My last 2 minutes and a last question. Last chance to win an Easter egg. Are you ready? A woodcut from William Caxton's second edition of Printed in 1483. I know the answer is always the Bible, Simon, but it isn't in this case. This is not the Bible. Any idea what book this is? Absolutely formative book in the English language. Helped to make English the vernacular of our country. Most influential novel of all time. No, not Pilgrim's Progress. Earlier than Pilgrim's Progress. What's this? Yes, have you got an egg already?
Yeah.
Oh, you can have another one, but it's right. It's the Canterbury Tales. But do you know that the Canterbury Tales isn't finished? The story of the setup is great. There's the pilgrims are going from London to Canterbury. They stop after their day's walk in a pub every night and they sit round a table, which is what this illustration is, and they tell their tall tales. And it's all for a bet. Whoever tells the best tale gets a free meal when they get back to London. That's the setup for the Canterbury Tales, and there's 24 stories in there. But he died before it was finished. And so we don't know the ending. There's a couple of stories. There's one about the squire and one about the cook. And they just stop and you go, oh, what happens next? They're great stories if you've never read them. Have a look in kind of updating, because Middle English is pretty hard to read. But they're not finished, and it leaves us kind of frustrated. And lots of people have done this. They've written their own endings. And so if you go on the internet, you can find dozens of alternative endings for the Squire's Tale or the Cook's Tale. And the Unfinished Symphony. People have had a go at that, haven't they? They've tried to write the end of Mahler's Unfinished Symphony and some of the other stuff too. And that's kind of, I think, the point of the way that Mark tells his gospel. He says it's unfinished because you've got to finish it. You've got to supply your own ending. I've told you the story. I've told you about Jesus' birth. I've told you about his life. I've told you about his miracles. I've told you about his teachings. I've told you about his death. He doesn't tell us anything about the resurrection. And we've got to decide for ourselves how the story ends. Whether this risen Christ will be part of our story. Whether we'll look into it any further for ourselves. Whether we will look at the story and the evidence and see what we think. After I'd spoken in the marketplace on Friday, another chap stood up and gave his testimony. And he'd been offered a Bible by a mate who'd kept on and on at him, and in the end he took it and said, I'll have a look at it. He said, I only took it because I was going to have a look at it. It was a gospel. I'll have a look at it just so I can prove that it's nonsense. He said, I got about halfway through and I realised this is something here. And it had changed his life, and he stood up in front of all the people and said, this has changed my life. I thought it was nonsense. I only read it to prove what nonsense it was, and now it's changed my life. Maybe that could happen to you. And I challenge you that it does this Easter, that you supply your own ending to this story. I pray God bless his words to us. So we're going to finish there. Thank you very much for listening. We're going to sing a traditional one, Thine Be the Glory. And we will stand for this. You might not be able to see the words, which is one of the reasons why we don't stand. But in our new building, we've got two great big screens high up, so you better stand. And if you can't see that one because you've got some big chap in front of you, you better look at the one over there. So that's going to be the new plan. But we know this hymn so well that even if you can't see the words, I reckon you'll do all right and be able to join in. Are you ready? wonderful. So we'll stay standing for a benediction. I've just put up this lovely picture of dawn, because that's what Easter means. Take that away if you forget all the rest. Dawn, and it could be a dawn for us all. And then these words of Easter blessing. Let me read them over you. May the miracle of Easter bring you new hope, new faith, and new opportunities. May you be blessed with the courage to overcome the challenges that you face and triumph over adversity, anxiety, and doubt as you experience the joy and power of the risen Christ in your heart. Amen. God bless you all, and happy Easter. Please stay for some cakes and tea and... Oh, hang on. Here's trouble.
Hang on. I'll talk loud. So do stay for tea and coffee. There's hot cross buns on my left and black coffee for you to dilute as you wish. In the hatch there's all manner of different types of drinks. We have a wonderful simnel cake. Please take cream eggs away with you. I've not had one yet, but I want them. So please take them away. But a very minor detail, not to eclipse what we've had this morning, but Simon is 62 today. And we've had some wonderful 2 cakes being made, 2 cakes bought for his birthday, and I know the people who brought them would like us to sing to you.
Oh, no. No.
So I'll try and choose a note, but happy birthday to Simon. Happy birthday to you.
This is terribly embarrassing.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Simon.
Thank you very much.
Happy birthday to you.
All right, great, everybody. Have some cake. Please have some cake.